All right. Hello. Thanks for coming by and taking a look at the video. If you're listening to us on the podcast, thank you for finding me and taking the time to listen. Today we're going to be talking a couple of different things, but we're going to start, like I think most people are starting these days, with coronavirus. This is what everybody's talking about. This is what's on everybody's minds. Once again, I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but it's got to be addressed. We've got to have a bit of a conversation. If you're watching me on the YouTube there, did I say on the YouTube? Jesus, I am in my 40s, aren't I? All right, so if you're watching on YouTube, I'm taking a little whiskey here that we bought, we stocked up on. Nothing too fancy, just a little Jack Daniels. And a Beware the Old Man in a World Where Men Die Young glass that a very good friend of mine got for me. So take a little break, have a little drink, and now we will get into this thing. I am looking at the government response, and I want to start by saying I view myself as a libertarian. I think if you've listened to me a couple of times, you already know that. But if you're new, I view myself as a libertarian. I believe in minimal government involvement in our lives and in our economy. And I think that we should be free to live our lives to the greatest extent possible, as long as we're not interfering with other people's ability to do so. So a lot of libertarians, there's a lot of fighting going on in the Libertarian Party right now over the government interventions, the lockdowns, the stay-at-home orders, and all the different things that the government is doing and expanding its power in the name of this crisis. It's something I've touched on many times. Well, not many times. I haven't done many of these, but I've touched on it in several of the videos that I have done. And I came out early on, and I will stand by it. I am in support of what the government has done in many states. I am okay with the stay-at-home orders. I am okay with the closure of non-essential businesses. What I should say is I was okay with it at the time it was done, and I stand by that, and I think that the governments did the right thing in trying to flatten the curve and slow the spread of this disease. I think that we weren't there. We didn't know how dangerous this was. I think we still don't. I still think there's a lot of issues on how contagious it is. The guidance is changing all the time, from wear a mask, don't wear a mask. How can it be transmitted? Is it airborne? Is it purely you have to contact and then touch your face, or how easy does it spread? I think we don't know when this spread really started. We don't know how many people have had this in the United States already. The death rates could be significantly lower than we think. They could be significantly higher. We don't know because we don't know how many people have had this. If millions of people have already had this and didn't even get sick, didn't even become symptomatic, are we overreacting? Is the death rate only so high because only testing symptomatic people and ignoring all the asymptomatic people who you didn't even know had it? So there's a lot of questions here about how dangerous this is. But I think that we're getting to a place now where we know what the proper preventative measures are. And I think that there's enough fear and nervousness out there right now that people are going to follow those procedures. I think social distancing, I've seen it myself. People are social distancing, and it's the norm now to stand away from each other. It's the norm to meet somebody and introduce yourself. I just met a gentleman today for the first time, and we didn't shake hands, and we both understood why. And so we are at a place now where we are educated enough as a society, educated enough as a nation to know what we need to do to keep ourselves safe. Okay. And I think a 2-week government closure of non-essential businesses, of shutting that stuff down, I think that was completely in line when this first started hitting, because we didn't know where we were at. This is the problem. And this is what I've been talking about when I've mentioned this in past podcasts, and I've talked about it on my Facebook page. You can find me there. Also, Brian for Liberty. Is that we don't have a structure to control emergency powers. Okay, so the government has declared an emergency. Our state is one of many that are shut down. And so what is our tool now to go back and say, okay, we've been under this order for this long. Let's get guidance out and let these businesses start reopening, right? I'm the government, and I responded to an emergency, to a crisis. These are the actions I took. Okay, but you can't make that permanent. And we don't have a tool. There's not a review tool right now in place that should be automatic. This can't come from I'm in Wisconsin. This can't come from the Republicans now, who are going to come back and say, okay, we think the governor's gone too far, because it's nothing but left versus right. This needs to be something that's already in place, so that now we're 2 weeks into this emergency declaration. We're 3 weeks into it, 4 weeks into it. As this thing moves on and on, is the governor an emptor, is the governor an emperor now, where he doesn't have to come back and validate that these measures are still necessary. We wanted to flatten the curve. We wanted to slow the spread. We know enough now about this disease and how it's transmitted to do that. I think that if you start reopening businesses, I do believe they're not going to be as busy as they were. I think a lot of people who would view themselves as being at risk would choose to just stay home. I think that people who do go out would be wearing gloves and carrying hand sanitizer and wearing masks and doing the things that are necessary to prevent themselves from getting sick. So now that the knowledge is out there, now that we have the things that we need to know to keep ourselves safe, it's time to start reopening businesses. It's time to start letting the economy get back to work. Again, I'm not flip-flopping on my position. I do believe that a lockdown, a closure of non-essential businesses on a short run was perfectly appropriate. I do not believe it needs to continue. And I'm very concerned that we don't have a system in place to override and to end a state of emergency and to take these powers away from a central, from the central authority, from Madison, from our governor. So that is very concerning. The second thing is we are going to be feeling some major economic issues after this, the extent of which is, I don't know if the extent of these damages, if I'm overly concerned or if I'm understating it, but I really believe that the impact on our way of life moving forward is going to be significant. The federal government has absolutely painted itself in a corner. It has spent $2 trillion at the outset of a crisis, and it's leaving that's before having to address the economic issues on the backside. I know I've gotten some pushback on the giveaways and the amount of lending and whatnot that the government's going to be doing to private business. Hey, these are loans. It's not necessarily going to cost us. A lot of these loans, a lot of this lending package is forgivable if these businesses keep their staff on until June 30. Well, all right, I'll take this massive loan out. I'll keep my staff on until a certain day. Then I'll fire the staff and I'll keep the money. There's not enough here. This bill is hastily put together. We spent $2 trillion at the outset, and we're going to be very tempted to ask the government to spend more money to jumpstart that economy after this thing starts unwinding, however long that may take. The government's got $23 trillion in debt. We had $1 trillion deficit going into the fiscal year with the new budget that was signed. We're going to see a major fall in tax revenues. I would not be surprised to see our government, to see us $26 to $30 trillion in debt at the end of the next fiscal year. And I want you to think about that. $26 to $30 trillion in debt, I think, is a very realistic target. You're going to be looking at still stunted tax revenues when the mandatory part of the budget, like Social Security and Medicare, we're going to have falling payroll taxes. You're going to have the interest on the national debt, which going into this fiscal was almost $500 billion on $23 trillion in debt. What's it going to be on $30 trillion in debt? The Federal Reserve is printing money massively to support the banking system, and there's going to be less productivity after the fact. I think we're looking at a strong inflationary, maybe even a hyperinflationary scenario, followed by a deflationary period. And I really don't know. I think we're going to be making a choice. We're going to be choosing between Greek-style austerity that we all remember from a while back, or we're going to face a real currency crisis. I think we're really in a position where we've heard whispers about the United States losing, and the U.S. dollar losing its place as the Federal Reserve currency, and I think that's this crisis could push that over the top. So there's a lot of danger here, and the worst part of this is, of course, like everything, a crisis, whether it is a health crisis or it is an economic crisis, is always going to hit the most vulnerable amongst us. And this is where I said at the end of the podcast last week, I said I was going to talk about racism a little bit this week. Gave more time to coronavirus than I wanted to, and that's probably going to be the way things are moving forward until we start coming out of this thing. But I think the conversation is going to go from health to economics. But at the end of the day, I think that the coronavirus and this is going to be dominating what we're doing here. But we know that situations like this always impact the most vulnerable amongst us. Let me start by saying government's not going to be able to solve these problems. I think we've talked about the economic limitations of what the government's going to be capable of doing. So I encourage people to go out there and find a way to do something, find a way to help people, find a way to give. If you don't have money, give time. Do what you can to help and reach out and start building those networks of people who can rely on you and that you can rely on, because I think things from an economic perspective are going to get very dicey moving forward. So I just want to encourage you to reach out, find your local charitable organizations, find the people in your community and on Facebook. I see them all over the place who are doing things to help the community. They're out there. They're volunteering. They're arranging food drives. They're doing things. They're sewing masks. They're doing all sorts of things to help. Find those people and find how you can be a help to them. And we can all get through this together. So I don't want to have another long, drawn-out conversation about racism. I think we're all tired of it. We've been talking about it for years, and I don't know that we're making any progress. I think the people who are talking about it the most, they're not making any progress. They're not winning anybody over to their sides, and I think they're pushing people away. And I think those who are the accusatory side of this, we live in a racist society. Our president's a racist. He's given cover to other racists, and the racists are coming out of the woodwork. There's a racist under every bed. The left is using racism a little bit like the right used terrorism to, create some fear, create some anger, and gain some control. I'm not buying into a lot of it, but I took a look at the systemic racism question tends to come up a lot. And the two big talking points are always white privilege, which I'm gonna hit on that at some point, probably this week. It's maybe the thing that irritates me the most is the conversation around white privilege. It bothers the hell out of me, but I will touch on that later in the week. But I spent this week kind of looking at systemic racism, and when we think about systemic racism, the accusations are always in the information is always kind of the same. It's harder for a black man to get a loan, even if he's got a similar credit score to a white person. It's harder for black men with a felony record don't get callbacks on interviews at the same rate that white people do. If you have a black sounding name, you're less likely to get a callback than, if you're Joe Smith. So they point at those things and they say, this is a systemic issue of racism, and it's preventing the African-American community from moving forward. I don't agree. I think all of those things may be true. I'm not disputing those things. I'm not going to dispute those findings. I haven't done the research and dug into the statistical analysis of it. I do know that you can make statistics say anything you want, so I take it all with a grain of salt. But let me pause here for a second and just tell you what I mean by that. You say that a black man and a white man with the same credit score, it's harder for the black man to get a loan. Statistically speaking, it's also true that a black person, even an affluent black person, will live in a neighborhood that's not as affluent as his white counterpart, earning roughly the same, in kind of the same economic situation, right? If that's the case, then you can't compare the credit scores because there's so many things that go into a home loan application, right? The value of the property, the loan to value ratio, where is the home, what's the expected appreciation rate of this home over the next 5 years? There's so many things beyond just a person's credit score, job, how long has he been at the job? All those different things go into determining whether or not a person gets a home loan. So you can say, here's a fact: black people, I shouldn't keep using men, but a black person isn't going to be able to get a loan even as easily as a white person, even if they have the same credit score. You have to break down so many different factors of every single loan application that's a very difficult thing to quantify and point to that it's because of racism. So I guess that's my issue with a lot of these things. A black sounding name not getting as many callbacks as a white sounding, I don't even know what that means. So if you have a traditional African name and you're not getting called back at the same rate, again, it goes, what's the job history of both people? Have they both have the equal level of experience, the equal level of education, are they equal in terms of the time on the job and job history? Has one job jumped more often than the other one? So there's so many different factors, and there are differences in the African American community in the United States and the white community. And the African American community, you can't deny the African American community has faced significant hardship. That has left a socioeconomic impact on the African American community. There's no question. But those impacts and their effects today don't necessarily mean that there's systemic racism. Some of these things are maybe lingering effects of that, but that doesn't mean that the system today that we're living in right now is systemically racist. And I think that's where I have a problem with this, okay? There's a lot of different things that go into what is going on in the African-American community in this country. And it's hard to, they're difficult conversations to have, because if you have the conversation, then you get called a racist. I mean that's, and this is what we elect, this is where we get to, you have Barack Obama as president of the United States, and every single person who disagrees with him gets called a racist, right? Then you get a Donald Trump, and he's a racist, and all these people are racist. And so elections have consequences, and we tend to get wrapped up in the moment, and we tend to not look back and say, how did we get to this place? What led to all of this? And I look at, just like coronavirus, okay, and the disease, the health concerns, and the economic fallout are going to hit vulnerable communities harder than they hit affluent, well-established communities. That is the nature of the world. It's not fair. It just is the way it is. So we look back at kind of the history from the Civil Rights Act, from the signing of the Civil Rights Act, the conclusion of the Civil Rights Movement in that area, right? And we look at all the other things that were going on in the country at that time, we could say you can make an argument for systemic racism, but it's not going to look like the argument that the left is making now. A couple of major government interventions into the world took place right around the same time that African Americans were finally getting treated, not just African Americans, but all minorities. The Civil Rights Act isn't just about black people and white people. It's all minorities, okay? So right at the time that the Civil Rights Movement kind of had its culminating event in terms of the Civil Rights Act, okay, some big things were happening. One of those things is that in the 1960, hold on, let me see. I think I've got this thing in here. Gave me a minute. I should have been more prepared. Shame on me. Yes, 1965. Gosh, I don't think the year was that important for me to pause so long, but whatever. I'm not going to edit it out. In 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson declared a war on poverty. Now, when you say that the welfare and food stamps and things like that, you say that African Americans are per capita, they use this way more, and that's part of the problem, and it's a dependence issue on the system. It's very, very easy to say that's racist. That's a racist view. But we have to understand it in context. In 1965, African Americans didn't have equal rights in this country, right? We were right in this whole movement, the Civil Rights Movement. This thing is all taking place at the same time, right? So, the Civil Rights Act gets signed, and almost simultaneously, I think within a year of each other, you have this massive new welfare program. Well, African Americans had been held down through real systemic racism, real societal racism for, decades, for the entirety of their existence in the United States, from Jim Crow to slavery. So they were much, much more susceptible to a welfare program per capita than their counterparts were, right? Than whites were. And whites were in a much better, much more affluent, much more stable situation than African Americans were at that point, right? So you create a massive welfare program that is undoubtedly there's going to be way more eligibility in a vulnerable community like the African American community. So a much larger percentage of the African American community than the white community ends up on welfare. And there have been study after study after study that show these programs are not a pathway out of poverty, but realistically create a cycle of generational dependence on the system. That's just the truth. You can look at it. This does not help people get out of poverty. Your parents were on welfare. You're probably going to be on welfare. And this is the sad truth of it. At the same time, not at the same time, a few years later, you had the war on drugs, right? From President Nixon. Drugs are enemy number one. We have a war on drugs. So you have this war on drugs, which does a couple of things, as expected, as anybody who has read any book on economics ever will tell you, you are not taking away the demand, but you are limiting the supply, and therefore the price goes up significantly. And then drug dealing becomes a very profitable, though very dangerous career choice. So what happens? Who's that going to impact? It's going to impact your vulnerable portions of society. So you've created a sense of dependence. You've created a sense of hopelessness, really, because that's what dependence is. Dependence caps your level of success. This is what I'm getting, and it starts to become difficult to see past that handout, that welfare. It's hard to see past that and elevate yourself beyond that. It becomes very difficult. That's where the cycle of dependence comes from, and in that cycle becomes a sense of hopelessness. So you're trapped in poverty, and you're looking for a way out. You don't believe in the fact that, realistically speaking, the American dream hasn't applied to you until now. You've got the Civil Rights Act, and we're going to say, okay, here, now you can go ahead and participate in the economy as an equal. It's very hard to believe that. But I can tell you this, I could sell drugs and I could become wealthy, and that's what the people in my community are doing. The rich people, the only rich people I know are people who engage in that activity, right? I don't think I'm going to be a movie star or an athlete. So the wealthy people I know are doing that. And so you create a segment of society that has the sense of hopelessness, this inability to escape their circumstances. You create a welfare system around that and start creating generational dependence, and then you create a massive black market for a product, and this hurt African Americans at that time in a couple of different ways. First, I think that they were much more susceptible to the drug trade, and second, they were much more susceptible to drug use. When you are depressed, when you feel hopelessness, when you feel that society is moving on without you, you want to escape that, and drugs are a great escape. And unlike their wealthy, affluent white counterparts who could do cocaine was very expensive. So what happened? We had the crack epidemic, and the crack epidemic tore the African American community apart. And the drug violence and the gang violence and all the things that came out of it, when I look at the argument, and then before I move on, and then mandatory minimums, right? Because rich, white, affluent people didn't have to deal drugs to make their money. Their neighborhoods weren't being torn apart with turf wars. So cocaine was not as associated with violent crime as crack was. So what did we end up doing? We ended up putting mandatory minimums on crack. That the reason that looks racist is because crack is a cheaper drug, more closely associated with violence, and cocaine is for rich white people. So it's not as associated with violence. So crack ends up with a higher mandatory minimum sentencing than cocaine. So you look at the crime epidemic, and you look at the drug epidemic, the war on drugs, the welfare state, these things, and you look at where the black family is today, and you look at an illegitimate, I don't like that word, illegitimate, non-marital birth rate, okay, in the African American community of 70%. And every study you read will tell you that children born into single family homes have a higher chance of not finishing high school. They have a higher chance of having criminal activity, all of these different things. This is the legacy, all right? I am a firm believer that had we not decided to create the welfare state, and had we not decided that drugs were public enemy number one in this country, that African American families were about a generation behind their white counterparts, and that today we would have a much more equally distributed economic spectrum across the races. I believe that 100%, because I don't believe African Americans, I don't believe the black community is less capable. I just think that at that time, at that moment in American history, they were simply more vulnerable. I think that the opportunities do exist for them. And this week, I'm going to talk a lot about historical black figures who have had incredible success in the worst possible circumstances. And Madam C.J. Walker is on is on Netflix. Her story is an amazing story, and there's tons of stories just like that. And that's not what we teach in this country. That's another issue. We teach slavery, oppression, the civil rights movement, a little Harriet Tubman, a little Martin Luther King. we don't talk enough about African Americans under the worst circumstances, under the worst forms of discrimination and racism, who have reached success. We're not teaching them that is available to them. We're not teaching that lesson to young black people in this country. And then that's why the message of white privilege bothers me, because we're going to give you a built-in excuse to not succeed. We're going to tell you that it's way more difficult for you to succeed, and then we're going to give you a built-in excuse for not succeeding, and then we're going to act surprised when you don't succeed. So pushing that message, I think, is, even if you want to sit and argue with me that this is a true thing and it's real and we can argue point by point, this is why white privilege exists, that's fine. What's the value in pushing that message? I don't think there is one. I think all you're doing is hurting young black people in this country by lowering their expectations from a very early age. But I would say that, if we're going to talk about creating equality, we have to do some things here. We have to get nonviolent drug offenders out of prison. We know that that our prison population is disproportionately represented by African Americans. We have to end the war on drugs. We have to stop telling people what they can and cannot do with their bodies. That's an absolute must. And we have to get rid of the welfare state. We have to phase that out completely. It has to go away. And we have to deregulate industry to the greatest possible extent. We need to let people have opportunities to start their own business. We have to create as much opportunity as possible while getting government out of our lives to the greatest extent possible. And you have faith that the African American community, the black people in this country, are more than capable of competing in that environment. I stopped thinking that that's not a possibility. That's maybe something that bothers me more. There's no difference, right? African Americans are every bit as capable, all right? They don't need voter ID laws. They know how to go get a driver's license. They don't need all this pandering is ridiculous. We need to free up the economy. We need to get rid of these ridiculous laws. We need to create as much opportunity as possible, and we just need to sit back and watch the success that you will see throughout the nation, regardless of race. So that's kind of where I'm at. I did a lot of reading. I was going to spend a little bit more time on it. I had more dates. I had more specific examples, but I wanted to spend some time on Corona. I don't want this to go too long. But thanks again for stopping by. I hope that you are following me on Spotify, Brian for Liberty, and you are subscribing to the YouTube channel, Brian for Liberty. You can find me on Facebook, Brian for Liberty, Instagram, Brian for Liberty. I am Brian for Liberty everywhere, even on TikTok. So thanks again, and we will see you tomorrow.